property rights reform in Peru. How I got engaged to design the reform, how I engaged others in the reform. I present some real statistics of household surveys, about 3,000 household survey we did in 2000, and then statistics of other surveys done in 2003 that show, what would they show? Basic valuation issues such as 79% of the new owners really feel secure in their properties, whereas before they didn't. 75% of new owners started investing in their properties or doing home improvements. Loans, mortgages, all lines of credits increased. Labor mobility increased by 17%. Possibility of working at cottage industries fell by 47%. Now I'm becoming like Al Gore. I'm going to give you all the percentages. You don't have to remember them. We're not going to quiz you. But a very important statistic is that the likelihood that school-age children of people who own property would go to work had been reduced by 28%. This is really extraordinary. Now, there are several other elements that I'm not going to talk right now, but they're right here. For instance, how education increased, how the fact that children going to school and not going to work get vaccinated, and therefore you have better education and better health prevention. All of these things, you'll see them through these pages. There are other stories as well, however. I am presenting stories actually from our dearest United States of America, where the principles of such reform have been applied by private parties. One private party that I present in the book is Bank of America, that is in chapter 5, I believe. And another private party is Deborah Thomas. I'm quite sad she's not here tonight. Who, as a private citizen, engaged in creating a community development herself. There are also other stories that I present that do not have happy endings. And these are stories that, unfortunately, don't have happy endings because they didn't apply the principles of reform. I would like, if you may allow me, to read a very brief part so you can also feel a bit how did I get engaged into this reform and this whole process, and how informality really touches us. So it is true, Dennis, I did join the bank in '91, and I haven't shortened or tall. I was the same height. I have a few more wrinkles than I had before. So in '91, when I joined the bank, I was part of a division called, at the time, Country Operations Division. Since '91, the World Bank had had several reorganizations, so I cannot really tell you how would that division be called today. But it was a division that would be working with macroeconomic analysis. So we were responsible for assisting several Latin American countries, and we did several very important, at the time, economic analysis, made recommendations for policy reforms, originated structural adjustment loans, supported macroeconomic stabilization, and coordinated privatization strategy programs. We were responsible for helping the reinsertion of several of the Latin American countries to the world economy again. If you recall, late 1980s, most of Latin America had defaulted in their sovereign debt. So our unit was supposed to be helping them reemerge. Macroeconomic adjustment was allowing a country to create an environment for economic growth that would attract foreign investment, mainly through privatizations. Privatization tasks generally look clear-cut, and Peru was no exception. Identify the state-owned enterprises, get agreement to privatize them from the Minister of Economy and Finance, negotiate with labor unions, a tough but manageable task in a relatively weak economy like Peru at the time, decide to break up the target companies if appropriate, and then proceed with valuation and pricing. Yet, as the privatization program unfolded in Peru, things became sticky. While the established rules, what I call institutions, and responsible entities, organizations, defined how companies and enterprises ought to operate, how transactions ought to take place, how contracts ought to be enforced, we came to an unexpected impasse. The majority of state-owned enterprises and their assets had not been fully recorded in any registry, mainly in the registry of companies. This rendered their valuation very difficult, especially problematic for commodities such as mineral ores. Again and again, we would bump into the hidden skeleton of institutional decay. It was surprising to find such a large percentage of an economy handled on an informal basis, especially since the enterprises in question were state-run. Of course, no one doubted the existence of these companies or that they were owned by the government. That's very important. No one thought that they were owned by Peruvian companies were owned by Argentina, right? So what was really the problem? Was it just an oversight that they were not registered? When we looked into addressing the problem by simply registering what was not registered, using the existing laws and regulations as well as the existing registries, we yet hit another wall. We knew what needed to be done, get the companies and assets registered. But the cost under the existing system was prohibitively high, and the necessary bureaucratic process seemed endless. Oblique rules, regulations, laws, an unpredictable number of agencies from which one had to get clearances, and the vast discretion afforded to officials complicated the process and made it obvious that we could not begin to privatize suitably within the existing system. Privatization would require a change in the institutional structures to allow these state-owned companies to be sold to investors and be publicly traded. It was only logical to ask the obvious. Why were these companies not registered? We discovered that an important element of the problem was distorted incentives, maybe. People did not consider the benefits of registration to be worth the trouble. How had this come to pass? We found that Peru experienced long periods of isolation from the international financial markets, most recently from the late 1960s to the early 90s. The basic written institutions dated back to the 19th century and were heavily influenced by mercantilistic ideas. When we helped privatize the principal state enterprises, we actually found ourselves working with a small economy and very limited market players. As companies did not rely on the international capital market for financing, registration was perceived as an unnecessary formality. It was a luxury that provided little or no added market value. The rules and organizations developed for a small and confined society with few transactions were wholly inadequate for what Peru wanted to become, an economy competing in the international markets. Now this is a story of the businesses and Peru's property rights story starting from the side of the businesses, but that was not all. Peruvian workers and farmers were just as affected by the inadequacies of this system. In 1990, more than 50% of the property owners were not duly registered, and these properties were called propiedades informales, informal properties. And people residing on them are commonly referred to as informales, informals. How do you like that? Well, that's how I felt. And I went to my boss and I said, why don't we do something on property rights? And he said, over my dead body. He did say that. But then I said, I am half Greek and half Balkanic, and I'm going to fight for it. And we did.